Okay, still trying to get our little thing going here. I thought the little button would hit it on there. Let's get the show on the road. Welcome to Evolution Hour, our latest installment with Peter's delightful steampunky visuals. And there's our website for those who wish to download all the cute little stuff in there. Whoops, okay, start it over again. There we go. Ah, yes, I know that laptops are awkward. That little screen and clicking all the stupid things. I'm a club-footed idiot on that. But anyway, let's also get the other little screen going here. Put our patrons. Okie doke. Oh, yes. Hendril and Rowley and Surus and Barbara and Ian and Convert Me and Stephen. I'll read them off. James Fitzwater, History Minor, Apologia, Ralph Pledger, Benjamin Simpson, Slava, Speed of Sound, Studio Demwings. Slava may be busy with stuff going on in Ukraine, danger time, so I haven't heard from him in quite a while. Command Cyborg, Duranku, Scott Duke, Christopher Johnson, The Lavender Lady, Antoine Bonds, Marigale Beddoes, My Unfinished Journey, Nana, Morton Nielsen, Bo Rasmussen, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams. Every one of you helps in ways that, it is very, very, very much appreciated. So anyway, clumsy opening, but at least the signal is running smoothly. We are nearing the end-ish of Jensen's trace book because we're into the appendices now, and we still have a long way to go on sources he hasn't cited yet. This appendix kind of reprises material on how he supposedly compiled all of his little stuff. So it's an awful lot of references to the same things over and over again. Posnick and the like that in that 2020 Bulgarud paper that he's cited in earlier areas, and I would contend is misrepresenting them there. He's stepping over the information that suggests that this is over a very long time. So it looks like as we get closer and closer to the end, he's got to be compressing masses of references, including an awful lot of the secondary stuff, unless maybe he forgets to cite some of it. He's already gotten one source that he cited, but he didn't put in the reference bibliography. So far, I haven't encountered the reverse of where he's not citing material, but we'll only be able to know that for sure when we get down to the tail end. After which point, we will be moving into a new realm where we will go after titans of the earth. The one that I picked up at that little creationist talk over in Idaho. And that should be an amusing little operation to ferret out how little new is in that little puppy. Anyway, Jensen does bring up a couple sources that I fortunately could find open access, and I'll be putting them in. Goldwig 2010, which is on the HYDE modeling technique. That's why I've got our little joke here, hide and seek. It effectively is talking about the more recent breadth of human evolution, but and it's trying to work out what the population levels in that were. And Jensen explicitly is relying on this data field for his model. The problem is, of course, he has to be compressing it because it explicitly noted 1,000 and 5,000 year frames where they were estimating, they were looking at the low ball estimates for population and the high ball estimates for population. And by and large, they kind of oscillate along where some of them are favoring the lower estimates and others are saving the newer ones. And of course, the farther we go down the line, the more those start coming together because you have better data field. Anyway, on the 10,000 K, they estimated about 2 million people for the planet at that time, which was at the lower end of the range, as opposed to some that had gotten up, I think, 18 million, something like that. And then, 20 million. And then for 5,000 years ago, that has grown to 18 million people. So over 5,000 years. And that's closer to the higher value of 24 million than to the lower value of 5. So you'll be able to check all that out on your own. Now, there's also some segments where they're dealing in increments from 3000 BCE on, which, by the way, is before the flood. The 10,000 and 5,000 are before the creation of the universe. But at any rate, there's no indication that there was any radical shift in demographic changes in their modeling or in the 1,000-year increments from that point on. And of course, none of that gets mentioned by good old Jensen. He then repeats tons of the previous sources over and over and over again that I'd already alluded to. And then he dropped a 2011 paper from Myers, which was on the haplogroup R1b, which we've already noted. And Danster, Cardinale, and others have noted, boy, has Jensen got this little puppy wrong. I'll be putting a link into that. And then he alludes to a 2016 paper from Kumar on another genetic modeling program, the MEGA-7. Now, what's interesting is he's supposedly making use of this program as well. But how could he really be using this all that vigorously when it doesn't seem to be relying on arriving at the young Earth creationist format that he's doing? And given the fact that all of his supplemental material is sufficiently obscure to figure out what the hell, how is he getting the numbers that he's getting? Only in one of his charts, which I mentioned way back, that only one of the charts that I could see in Jensen's analysis, I could figure out where he was arriving at the numbers simply by compressing an already existing data set down. But he's using little conversion wiggle factors in there. And I'm suspecting that he's doing so fairly uniformly, not on a sliding scale, so that there is relatively little adjustment when we get down to the far end, because that's consistent with the fact that in too many instances, he's pulled things down to ridiculously recent appearances, as he was doing with the Jewish haplotypes, as he was doing with the Italian ones that are known from the Neolithic. So I suspect, but cannot verify because these damn supplemental charts are so obtuse, that where are you getting this from? I have no idea. Now, part 2 of the show relates to of CMI, Creation Ministries International, who love to retread older material, often way past its shelf date. And one of the ones they particularly loved are stuff from Carl Wieland. And this one is an old 1994 post by Wieland and Russell Grigg on golden numbers. And the last time they retread it was back in 2010, and now they did it just this month. It's basically a Gee Whiz thing on the underlying mathematical structure of things. Hi, Brian. Which is pretty well par for the course, and so forth and so on. And it's they talk about the mathematical underlying structures of things, which reflects, quote, all the created products of God, the master designer, unquote. Well, one of the little items they were making a great deal of hay about concerns Fibonacci numbers seen in the spiraling whorls of plants and other kinds of things. And this is a fascinating issue of why certain structures follow into that realm. Why does gravity operate the way it does mathematically? Why does E equal mc squared? This is kind of a Platonic side, and I have a little bit of a Platonic streak in my thinking as to why my opinion is that the universe is what mathematics does for a living. But is it just all magic-y as to why all of this stuff is working out? So the old paper from 1994 was kind of dangling that evolutionists really can't figure any of this out as to why any of this is running, and mentions a few minor approaches as to what was going on. They referred to unnamed, quote, French scientists, unquote, and then referred to a secondary source rather than to the actual papers that suggested that the Fibonacci series was coming up as a management of growth. In other words, mathematical modeling would build this into the system as a natural way of growth can be managed. Now, the scientists in question are actually Douady and Couder. And they went on in much greater length on this particular topic in a trio of 1996 papers. So shortly after the 1994 Whelan article, but long before the 2010 2010 reprise of the Whelan article, and obviously way before the 2023 reprise of it by CMI. And I'll be putting the links up to all three of those little papers, so you can take a look at what their work looks like compared to what the gloss was being presented in Whelan, and also have they thought to do anything on it in the decades since? Creationists? Not as far as I can see. They just really don't bother about it. Anyway, the reason why I think this is kind of relevant is that it's like the fossil genie dropping fossils on you at just the right point. A week after CMI's post appeared, a new paper appeared in Science on leaves and sporangia developed in rare non-Fibonacci spirals in early leafy plants. Now, this, alas, is so new that it isn't available open access anywhere. But you will be able to at least get the abstract in Science, and I will be putting a link up to a commentary on it at the conversation that explains why this is so particularly relevant. And it all has to do with the idea that the earliest plants weren't showing this Fibonacci series, and that therefore this is a derived characteristic rather than something that was designed into things from the very beginning. It's something that developed from an evolutionary point of view. And you then to be wondering what selection pressures might have been affecting on this, management of growth, as those three anonymous French papers were doing. But there's also quite a lot of other works that had materialized. One way back in 1982. These are some articles that were mentioned in that conversation, secondary posts. Unfortunately, two of them are open access, so I'm going to be linking to them. One was from 1982 by Ridley, which was on how sunflower heads, that Fibonacci series arrangement is extremely efficient in terms of energy usage. And then another one from 2020 by Strauss, which is that this was, quote, to maximize the amount of light that each leaf receives, unquote. So all those little mathematically people who start applying mathematical processes to natural systems can see structures to things in so many different contexts, and the Fibonacci series is just one of them. Now, the upshot of this is that these 400 million year old Rhynie Chert fossils are lacking that feature. That may very well be the case. The dynamics of energy efficiency is certainly going to be playing a role in any biological system. And their commentary on it was that they were suggesting that Fibonacci-style patterning was not ancestral to living land plants. And we must naturally think, when exactly did they appear? And under what circumstances? The creationist, where all of that Rhynie Chert stuff is all mushed into the flood, would theoretically have all of that as just yet another weird variation on a theme in which everything is created during the creation week. Although, remember, plants were made before the stars and the sun and the moon. So if we go by day 4. And so it's a hilarious little operation to look into. This week, I was diving into filling in details on some other creationist stuff for future shows. And one of the things, I'll give you a little sneak peek. One of the things that is hitting is on ooids, which are little itty bitty grains that are found. And a creationist just this last year did a paper, dear old Michael Ord, who is staggeringly self-confident and sloppy as hell when it comes to his source material. And so this will be kind of fun to linkage. Unfortunately, enough of the material was available that I was able to include it, because I always like to make primary source material available in these part 1s and part 2, so everybody doesn't have to take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. No. I mean, you might find that I've proven to be a trustworthy person, and so you can go, gosh, I bet what RJ is saying about this is actually valid, and let's find out. but you don't need to take my word for it. And indeed, I'm always wanting to encourage people to follow up on their own, because if I can do it, anybody can do it. It's an easy peasy thing to do in the modern internet era, where you can download primary sources. A trick that I use in rare instances where I can't get a PDF of something is to copy it out as a Word document file, and then I can save that, and so I can do word searches and all of that kind of stuff. Not all PDFs, alas, you can do word searches on. Sometimes, some of them you can, and others you can't. There are some awkward. I just spent some time going through Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the proto-Nazi eugenics racist, for material that's going to go into Rocks 2 on the discussion of what connections, if any, does Darwin and evolution and Haeckel and all these others have with the rise of fascism and Nazism and the Holocaust and all of that. And it's spoiler alert, it's not nearly as much as creationists want to make you think. Anyway, Houston Stewart Chamberlain was kind of interesting because Erica, friend Gutsick Gibbon, had called attention to him and had noted that here he was one of the architects of the German Nazi eugenics policy as a guru, although he died early enough that he wasn't in the Holocaust end of things, but that he was a non-Darwinian. So to say that he was, I mean calcified sand, yeah, pretty much, yeah, and they come in a variety of things. The interesting bit about the ooids is that large ones are not typically formed today, and so a lot of the science discussion has been, why is that? Well, another spoiler alert, turns out to be related to oxygen levels. And Ord quite casually neglects to mention any of that material, even though it was explicitly discussed in the source material that he drew access to. So all of that will be discussed in a couple of weeks, because I've bumped it down the line with other stuff. I think we're doing some starlight stuff next week. Another giant topic that's quite fascinating. Anyway, to do this research on Houston Stewart Chamberlain required that I dust off my old college German, because it turns out one of the sources that helped document that he was in fact a completely anti-Darwin. He did not like Darwinian brand of evolution at all. Was in this monstrously long, sometimes published as a 2-volume work. So, I mean, it's like 500, 600, 700 pages all told in German. So, and I was able, yay, download the bloody thing off of archive.org or Gutenberg, one of the two, had the whole thing as a PDF. So I was able to download it. Unfortunately, it didn't have text search in it. So I had to go through. Fortunately, I was able to locate this particular quotation that related to him specifically criticizing Darwin. And I knew enough about German to be able to know what certain words would be in German. So, and it turns out somebody else had mentioned it in a criticism of creationist positions on it. This was quite a long time ago, and I've spotted it online, where he had pointed out which chapter it was in. It was on the one on Plato in Chamberlain's book. So I spent a couple days wingling through page by page by page by page by page this monstrously long with impenetrably massive German paragraphs. I mean, you know, more semicolons you could shake a stick at in there, looking for these particular word nodes to confirm that in fact he had said this thing, and to confirm that the translation of it that I had seen was a valid one, because, you know, sometimes people can wiggle up. Greetings, hello, Purple. And it turned out, yep, I found it. It took me a while. It took me a while to find. But on the way finding it, I found quite a few other areas where he was dumping on Edward Drinker Cope. He kept on calling him an evolutionary fanatic, which you might say, but boy, I mean, it was clear that Stewart Chamberlain was a snarky son of a bitch. And he also wrote some just hilariously bad public pronouncements in a variety of contexts. So all of that, we're going to be having a really nice segment on that. And I even finished up some sidebar material that served double duty for my projects Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, and also the science work relating to H.G. Wells, because Wells had a eugenic streak side, and it's been a debating point as to how severe that was, as well as being anti-Catholic and a little bit of an anti-Semite. Well, more than just a little bit of an anti-Semite. And as it turns out, I'd gotten a very nice work that delved into both the eugenics angles, quite a few works on that subject, but also a really neat little book that delved into a really comprehensive survey of his various writings, from fiction to nonfiction, way beyond. I wasn't even aware of just how prolific Wells was, and in fact, probably too prolific. I have to get up in 5 hours to take Sloth Girl chemo. Yeah, well, that takes priority, Purple. Don't have to worry about it. You can listen to my mug anytime at your convenience. So get some shut-eye and proceed with the important things in life, and stick me on as a caboose somewhere down the road. Anyway, Wells, I was obviously aware of the big Wells because the Time Machine and War of the Worlds and all of that stuff. And Paralogs of Fog is riffing off of both the H.G. Wells world, science fiction world, and also the Jules Verne world, ramming them together. And so it was intriguing to find out a bit more about Wells's approach to things. And so this delved into an awful lot of aspects of him, his obsessions. He had an absolutely terribly bleak upbringing. In fact, it stunted a lot of his health. And so things about food as well as sex occupy an enormous amount of his obsessions all through his life. And he... another detail that I knew from researching Things to Come, the science fiction story, although he didn't quite think of it in those terms, I'll put that down there. If you ever have a chance, you can see it freebie online on one of the websites that keeps track of that, although it's not a terribly good print. But it's still, and the Shape of Things to Come book on which it was based, I think is also available open access. You can download it, and it's not nearly as interesting as the film. But anyway, that Things to Come area, by the 1930s, Wells was unbelievably popular. You'd have to think Richard Dawkins plus Neil deGrasse Tyson plus Stephen Hawking squared. And this probably got to his head. He had quite an ego. That was fascinating, and he had a kind of snarky sense of humor and that. So it was an illuminating episode to find out rather more about what was going on inside of his head and his ups and downs in his life that had to figure in, because there are aspects of some of the other stories, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and that are figuring in the later Paralog stories, as we move further on into the 19th and into the 20th century as well. And so it proved a very useful sidebar that clarified a lot about stuff. Yeah, well, I agree completely on that, Purple. I mean, Wells, in my own conceptual thinking, and because Paralogs of Fog reflect another side, and let me do a shameless plug on the Bloody Things. I mean, I'm very proud of these novels. They're good reads, and I'm currently working on number 3, and there will be 12. Count them, 12. By the time we get down to the end of the road, if I can live long enough to do it, all the way up to 1908 and a little bit beyond. Wells, in many respects, is within eyeshot of Rod Serling Twilight Zone, in that, unlike Jules Verne, who was a popular science ground everything in reality geek, except an awful lot of the stuff that he would be drawing on would turn out to be wrong. So he could do a story like Journey to the Center of the Earth that, from our perspective geologically, is absolute claptrap. Although the 1959 movie with James Mason of Journey to the Center of the Earth is just delicious, plus it's got a spectacular score, worth the price of admission just for the Bernard Herrmann music. But and in that case, just like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the screenwriters had to add a lot of human interest detail, including some women characters for Journey to the Center of the Earth, that humanize it and give it a gravitas and an emotional kick that the original stuff didn't. Verne was apparently a happily married fellow and had a nice family and all of that, but he didn't tend to put women characters in his story. And frankly, in the science fiction stories, neither does Wells, although he has women a lot in the fiction that he wrote that wasn't science fiction. Although they tend to be, you know, femme fatales and various other aspects of things, or stupid ladies that he disapproved of their philosophy or whatever. But in the science fiction tales, they're not to be found. You don't find a woman character in First Men in the Moon. You don't find any women characters humping around except for Rena. In the 802,701 in the Time Machine, and that's hardly a fun date in that respect. The film version of that George Powell did created a more human interest angle as well. So generally speaking, Wells has to be tinkered with. But where Verne and Wells really differ is in that ability to take a premise and just ponder the concepts of it. Well, that's partly true, but there's also the human interest angle and the idea that human relationships and emotional relationships, and as well as the element of women, that half of the population, and shouldn't they be doing something, that it didn't even occur to those writers that they needed to put women in a story for any reason. And certainly stories that were set in the future, Wells's Things to Come was a fascinating example of that, because he actually had a kind of women's liberation aspect to the original version of the movie, and that got cut out when it didn't do terribly well, and they chopped about 20 minutes out of the film. And what got stunk was that women's liberation, women being scientists and the like, and you don't see women in positions of authority or notable in the finished version of the film. There's only just a couple women characters in the entire storyline. Anyway, Wells could do what Verne never could, which was just take a premise and run with it. So he could invent a time machine. He could do an invisibility formula that inadvertently drives you nuts. He could do, if he wants to get a scientist to the moon to see the Selenites and study insect society as a contrast with human beings, well, Professor Caver invents anti-gravity paint. Ta-da! And we got it all done. And when I was doing my story in Paralogs of Fog, I'm looking at it. I read a really fascinating history of steampunk when I got the big bug to write the first Paralogs novel. And it reminded me about H.G. Wells and Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and a whole bunch of stuff that were classified in the progenitors of steampunk. And then the element that you needed to deal with social issues and gender roles, and the idea of having strong women characters, and all of that was the aesthetics that I was going for. And therefore, I took Aouda, who was basically a princess, rescued princess doormat in the story. She's beautiful and everyone adores her, and she does absolutely nothing in the plot. And that's a rarity even for Verne to include a woman in a storyline, but she's just kind of baggage. I then went on to make her a very dominant character in the story and make a point of having strong women characters in the various, both in villains and in protagonists. That's an interesting possibility. And in the same way that young people are often thrown off by that aspect, it's interesting that the John Carter. Some of the steampunk can be awfully mannered and arbitrary. If you look at something like that gigantic Mortal Engines movie that Jackson did a couple years back, which wasn't a terrible film, but it was probably about a half hour too long. And it was just spectacular in its visualizations of things. And yet I felt it was underwritten. And there were plot details and elements that probably needed buffing up. So in all of my writing, I kind of try to pretend like I'm Daryl Zanuck. If you're, I agree, pulpits become a trope. Yeah. Darryl Zanuck was the head of 20th Century Fox for many, many years, and he produced in the later period in his life The Longest Day and Magnificent Men of Their Flying Machines and a lot of stuff. And he was kind of a social conscious kind of guy, more so than what you would tend to find over at MGM and some of the other studios. But what intrigued me about Zanuck and also any of the other producers, Howard Hawks and the like, and for that matter, Alfred Hitchcock, who tended to produce a lot of his own material, and that is their attention to internal plot structure and pacing. Hitchcock was greatly affected by working with David O. Selznick, who they were both control freak people. And when Hitchcock was brought to America by him, as by Selznick, Hitchcock hated any meddling because he was a constant sending memos down as to what was going on, and sometimes Hitchcock would just stop the production and start having tea when he showed up on set, and say, "Go away, I won't be filming until you're gone," because they were both control freaks. But it did have a positive effect on him because Selznick got Hitchcock to think about character development and emotional highs and all that. And the films that he started to make from the mid 1940s on in that Selznick orbit carried him through. He changed the way he did films, and all the films he was doing, Notorious and these others, are much richer and deeper than would have been in the early thriller eras that he was doing, the suspense films that he was doing from The Man Who Knew Too Much in the 30s down to when he finally came to America to do Rebecca. So that cross-fertilization I try to interconnect up. One area that both Verne and Wells lapse on that I try to remedy, hopefully, in my works, because I am a writer who loves dialogue and witty dialogue, sharp, clever dialogue. And neither one of them write scintillating humor in their stories. They have light little jabs every once in a while. There's a drollery. I think in Verne's case, some of the stuff is probably more amusing in French. But I don't read French, and I've not read any of the novels in French. So that is a different ambience. Wells is English, and although he can do some little clever snarks, and probably the best stuff he ever did in terms of writing dialogue was stuff for Things to Come. But still, it's not sharp banter. And so one of the things that I love introducing into a storyline is that aspect of Nick and Nora Charles from The Thin Man element, and also Steed and Peel from the old Avengers TV series. Those archetypes of quick-witted, clever, droll, sardonic, self-deprecating elements are features that I try to put into my storylines because I love that sort of material. So anyway, there we went on with a digression on that, but I try to embody in the novels the same cultural and philosophical perspective that I'm showing in the nonfiction stuff. There's never any magic. There's advanced technologies. Passepartout has a whole bunch of interesting stuff. Phileas Fogg has his interesting stuff, and so does HYDE. And I had to think through the logic of it with a Jules Verne sensibility as to, okay, you've built an atomic-powered flying machine in 1860-something. How did you pull that off? Where did you get your uranium? How would you have done all of this? How small can you make it? And all that kind of stuff. I can take some liberties with the features of things, but I try to ground it. And that's a kind of thing that Wells didn't bother about. Now, where Wells, I mentioned The Twilight Zone, Wells, like Rod Serling, is often taking a premise and just running it with it. So they could have a time machine, or they could have aliens coming in to invade the Earth, or they can have people escaping from a planet for whatever reason, or stranded on a planet. Often they would have that old Henry-style twist ending as a major feature to it. But where Serling blows Wells out of the water is that Serling and the various people who wrote for the show, that he also included Earl Hamner, the Waltons guy, was that they were wordsmiths, and their use of dialogue. The only one that I can think of in that period that had that just finely honed sense of mood from dialogue was Ray Bradbury. And Bradbury, who I don't think did anything for the Twilight Zone, but he did actually do a couple episodes for the Alfred Hitchcock series, the half-hour version of it in the 1950s. And he did a couple episodes, one about, I think, a robot replicant that a guy created to occupy his wife while he was away doing whatever he wanted to do. And it turned out that the wife enjoyed the replicant better than him, and they decided to bump off or squirrel the real husband, who was quite a drip, away. And then I can't remember what the other storyline was about. But Bradbury typically was extremely difficult to translate into visuals because he is such a wordsmith. That's what's another feature about studying things in the mystery context, and that is that stories that are talking about what people say and do are much easier to film than ones that are telling you what they're thinking. Because how do you convey what's going on in somebody's head? And that's why I was so struck by the difference between Dorothy L. Sayers and Wilkie Collins, the 19th century pre-Sherlock Holmes era novelist, mystery novelist, how different they were in that respect. They would drop into people's heads, as opposed to ones that are relatively easy to film, like Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and the like, where everything is what they say and do. There's never an example in any of those stories that I know of where you get into somebody's mind. And so if in that respect, they're easily filmed. So I am approaching all of these little things cinematically as to what people can say and do. But then there's also the philosophy angle of it, which is a secular approach to things, which is a sense about a wry understanding of what social inequalities there are, even if you're not planning on taking over the world and changing them all. Nonetheless, you're aware of them being there. And so Verne, for example, avoided those subjects like the plague. He doesn't talk about too much in the way he skirts past it a little teeny bit. He's thumbing his nose at the British when he has Captain Nemo be Prince Dakar, that was deposed during the Sepoy Rebellion. Oh, well, I got to say, which Dune? I must say the new Dune that's come out, which part 2 I think is supposed to be out next year or so, is extremely good. I'm still fond of the David Lynch Dune, if only because it was such an incredibly difficult subject to pull off. A bunch of directors had tried to film Dune, including Steven Spielberg, and nobody could get a traction on it. And although it's got some hyperbole and over-the-top elements in certain areas, particularly in how they was depicting Baron Harkonnen, or Harkonnen, as they pronounce him in the new Dune version, I give it a big set of thumbs up, and it is also a very good film score, too, that is underrated. Given how much story he had to tinker with, it works exceedingly well as to how he managed to pull all of the crap together. And so I have a soft spot for Dune. And I can appeal to Harlan Ellison when he was reviewing stuff in the old days, Less than the Need for Playwriting, Harlan Ellison, when he reviewed the 85 Dune for Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, said it was the Gone with the Wind of science fiction films. He was quite impressed by it. And I got to say that as well. It had been problematic. There's some tinkering and things that I would have done with it and adjusting on it. And Lynch, of course, is a quirky, surrealist kind of producer in so many respects. Went on to do Brazil and all of that. But still, there's an awful lot about it that intrigues me. I think. Did he do Brazil? Was that Lynch or somebody? No, that was the Monty Python guy. My mistake. Anyway, so all of those things are flomping around in my head, and something else that is fun to do, and I couldn't possibly have done the Paralogs novels 10 or 15 years ago, is because there's the historical angle to it. So when they visit San Francisco in December of 1872, I wanted to make it the actual accurate San Francisco for 1872. And so there are no cable cars yet. And certain areas of the bay haven't been filled in yet. And there's a giant spur out in the middle of the bay where the railroad starts up. It isn't even in Oakland yet. And ferry boats come in. All of that is very, very different from even the San Francisco of 1890. And I was delighted to find out all of that. So I get to play historical time machine person to reconstruct the past as accurately as possible for the narratives that are moving through the various time spaces that are going on. And so I'm having a delightful, fun time with it. It gives a little bit of a sidebar on my brain as well, if I get frazzled doing all the science research for the rocks were there and future books that Jackson and I will be doing on various themes. I've always got that little sidebar that I can escape to the Paralogs series. If I'm lucky, I'll find out whether or not we're sailing down the Mississippi River by Christmas time, in which case I'll be about halfway through the second novel, in which case theoretically by somewhere around the end-ish of 2024, I should be able to get the third Paralogs novel out. And if I can pull that off, I will be churning them out as best as I can on a fairly steady assembly line. It took me 6 years to do the second novel, and that's because I was working on those two science books at the same time. And also that I was working out the third novel, which is taking place in the other half of the second novel, and the plotting and superstructure for the 9 books beyond that. So yeah, I wasn't just working on the second book. So anyway, that kind of gets you up to speed on that. I've really rattled on that, but if I'll very much remind you that science fiction is never far removed from a discussion of the science fact. And so many cultures and issues are addressed in the form of science fiction. Rod Serling could do social commentary on the Twilight Zone that he could no longer do on Playhouse 90. Yeah, well, I'll tell you, natural disasters are oddly difficult to do. I'm surprised to realize that there's never been a good asteroid impact movie. The closest one, I think, Deep Impact was pretty good. Armageddon was over-the-top schlock. Meteor was kind of a yawner, even though it had a really good cast. And so it's like there's something hard to pull off with that kind of a plot. You've got other not quite natural disaster things. There was Climate Frozen World in Robert Altman's Quintet, which is an absolute it's got Paul Newman and other people in it, and it's just tedious. And that then brings up the issue of why is it that certain people who are perfectly capable of making superb motion pictures in non-science fiction contexts trip over their feet when they try to do science fiction. And in part, I think it's because they think they know the genre when they don't. Stanley Donen, who did a variety of motion pictures from Singing in the Rain that he helped do to the classic Charade, which is one of my favorite suspense films of the 1960s, Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn. Did a film with Kirk Douglas, Saturn V or something like that. Absolutely, it was elaborate and fairly expensive, and it just was tedious to watch. Core was so scientifically accurate it could have been written by a creationist. Yes. Oh yes, Core. It actually has got some pretty pleasant little moments to it. I mean, from a dramatist point of view, as to what they were trying to build up. This was about a problem about the cataclysm involving plate tectonics with I can't remember whether it was the Earth was kind of. There was even another one that was on almost the same silly theme, where the Earth kind of gave birth to a new moon. The day the Earth exploded, or something to the Earth. It had Dana Andrews in it, a very aged Dana Andrews at that time. And some of these things have their little interesting moments, but no, the scientific implausibility, just as Journey to the Center of the Earth is absolutely preposterous geologically, but it's a ripping good movie. And so you part of your brain can kind of disconnect from that and just accept the wing it and just see where you go with it dramatically. And what is fascinating is that neither Verne nor Wells achieve really powerful dramatic elements. They achieve vignettes and they achieve concepts that can be made into very interesting movies, but film them straight in the same way no one but an idiot would try to film the original Frankenstein novel straight. It's actually fairly visual in the way that it's done, but my God, it's a yawner if you tried to do it that way. So that's another side issue as to whether or not a film, a particular written novel is cinematic or not, and whether it has internal structure and that makes it well. And so I would contend that many a film, many a book can be done where you really do have to tinker with it. For one thing, condensing it down into the time frame. I think Erich von Stroheim actually filmed the novel. I can't remember what the original title of the thing was, but he made it in Greed, which he came up with a 12-hour-long print. And so this would have been a great for miniseries, but not for a theatrical film. And then there's a tiny shortened version. This is like 1924 or 5, and it was one of the notorious out-of-control productions that Erich von Stroheim did in the 1920s. But anyway, I digress yet again. I always put the links, shameless plug, for all the books, both the fiction and nonfiction, in the area in the end. And so I donated copies of both of the novels to my public library. I tried to do that with The Rocks Were There, but or Evolution Slam Dunk, one of the two. But I haven't heard back to whether maybe they're leery about sticking it in there, although they put creationist stuff in the library. So what can I say? Anyway, until I get a hearing on that, I won't be donating any more of the science books to them. But they seem okay with the novels. So anyway, we got way over thing. We're nearing almost to another. Try to look into why the majority of movies are all 90 minutes. No luck on that. Oh, well, it depends on the era. Certainly, films that were written in the old days when you used to do double features, and you would have cartoons, and you would have newsreels and all the rest. You needed to have the movie fairly short, hour and 40 minutes for the big feature, and preferably well under an hour and a half for the little B movie that was connected up to it. But what amazes me, because I've been studying the screenplays of so many of these classic films, the number of films that are just about an hour and a half long. The Day the Earth Stood Still is about an hour and a half long. Quatermass in the Pit is about an hour and a half long. The Day the Earth Stood Still is about an hour and a half long. Forbidden Planet is about an hour and a half long. And so it's just an amazing bunch. There are longer ones. One of my favorite science fictions, The Andromeda Strain from 1970, is over 2 hours. Quatermass in the Pit is my textbook example of an absolutely letter-perfect, razor-sharp express train of a script. It's not got a missing moment in it, and it carries you in this Ronald Neame, who did the screenplay on it based on the old series that he had done for the BBC, editing down some characters and that, which I could have preferred actually that he would have left some of the little details in, but nevertheless, it was just exquisitely done. And I'll type that in. If you haven't seen Quatermass in the Pit, for God's sakes, do that, because and there's a new version of it on Blu-ray with the audio commentaries from the people who made it and all that. That it is just an absolute gem, absolutely magnificent. One of the great classic science fictions of all time. It had an enormous. That's another matter of how much was cut for commercial purposes, and sometimes for politically correct issues. The natives jumping up and down on the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was considered a little too politically incorrect when it was initially issued on video. And so it got often chopped out Although finally, when we got into the widescreen era and they were doing full length prints and all of that, they put that material back in, and you just go with it and deal with it as you will. I'm always a purist on the idea that the film should be shown in the original version that it was made in, even if it's got problems, and just go with it. And then you can make of it what you will. So I don't like things chopped down and tinkered with and all that. You let the chips fall where they may. By and large, though, science fictions, unless you were looking at some of the Fritz Lang movies that his screwball wife, who stayed in Germany after he left, and she was a Nazi sympathizer, put into the Woman in the Moon, the Frau im Mond, which has just some weird little subplots that make sense from that racist, anti-Semitic framework that she was coming from. Hi, Vandalia. Almost at the end. Love Quatermass movies. They seem like few. Oh, yeah. The first, they were originally a TV series done for the BBC, and the first two were made into relatively low-budget movies with Brian Donlevy in them, who was by that time a has-been American actor who had a drinking problem. And I actually always had a soft spot for Brian Donlevy. I liked him. And the two film versions were actually quite nicely done. The third, Quatermass in the Pit, came out in the late 50s. And by the way, it, at least, is actually available in the original BBC version that was like 3 hours long. It was on, I think, half-hour episodes or something like that. It's actually available on video as well. But it didn't get filmed at the time. And eventually Hammer Films, that had made the first two films in black and white, still had the option on the bloody thing. And they decided they would trot it out as they were by then switching to color, and they were doing a little bit bigger budget movies. They were finding that their various Peter Cushing vampire hunter movies and that were doing really well. And they always had high production values, good cast, good writing, wonderful sets and costumes. They had a weight to them that didn't make them trivial. Oh yeah, the BBC version is really intriguing for what gets put in and what gets put out. I'll tell you this, the cast is way better in the film version. Everybody in it's better. If you've seen A Night to Remember, from the director of A Night to Remember on the Titanic is the director of the film version of Quatermass in the Pit. And the guy that plays Captain Rostron of the Carpathia is the fellow that played Colonel Breen in the TV version of Quatermass in the Pit. All sorts of connections. And the fellow that played in the CIA agent Felix Leiter in Goldfinger, a Canadian actor, was the one that played Rhynie and is just not nearly as riveting. And although the actor who played Quatermass in the TV series all the way through all the different episodes has an interesting quirkiness to him. I think Andrew Keir is just stunning as Quatermass in the film version. And oh yes, oh Doctor Who, oh yeah, as Doctor Who was kind of clunking along, they did a couple film versions of a couple of the plots in color, 64, 65, something like that. They were basically retreads of the earlier version, and he was playing it as kind of the avuncular grandfather element on them. They're quirky little sidebars. Effectively, they're simply redos of episodes that were on in the original TV series. So they try to make a little movement out of that. Where Doctor Who got into high gear was that it started being shown on PBS channels in various iterations in the 70s on, and make a movie trailer of The Rocks Were There and Who Will Play You and Jackson. I'm afraid it's not dramatic enough. I am perfectly happy with them doing the paralogs of Phileas Fogg. I intended them as things that you could do as movies. And so I would see that quite easily. Now, a documentary series on The Rocks Were There, that's quite a different kettle of fish, but it wouldn't be it could be done as a documentary format, and it would be about the process of the history of things. And I think it would probably be quite a few episodes to pull off, even just taking a smattering of high points to reflect the various aspects of it, and dealing with, like an hour per episode to cover stuff, yeah, you wouldn't be able to hit the entire books off, but you could easily do at least one for each chapter and maybe some material to kind of bookend on either end. So you're talking about 7 or 8 episodes. There's a possibility. If anybody ends up trying to do that, you know how to get in touch with me. Heck almighty. Anyway, but the paralogs books were all, I visualized them as a visual story. I'm a very visual kind of a writer, in addition to doing the dialogue aspect of it. And the one thing that when I was bumping into people in writers groups and that, after I'd finished the books, over 55 minutes, we've got almost a full hour. Yeah, I could see that as a PBS miniseries too, Purple. I think it would be perfectly fine on public broadcasting. And it would be a matter of the visualization of it, the little, the dramatis personae, and bringing out the scientific information, and you'd be able to do things like the reptile mammal transition. You'd be doing visuals and all of that, and you'd want to have that sense of chronology, and to bring out that whole scholarly issue of how people keep in creationist community, they keep repeating the same tropes over and over and over again, and have that parasitical aspect of it is something definitely want to bring out in kind of a show like that. Anyway, but Paralogs is just an adventure, and it's a realistic adventure. It's a fun adventure. I wanted to have, like Rick Steves goes to the 19th century, to where all of the historical details would be accurate. And although there's some amazing made up stuff in it, there are also characters that you can have fun hanging out with. That Uda and Thomasina Maker are the one that I came up with fully. And then all the little banter back and forth between Passepartout and Fogg and all the various folks around there are hopefully people that are quite entertaining, and you want to see what happens with them. And I enjoy writing the stories. I'm grappling now with issues of interesting little plot details of how to connect up all the little dots for this new storyline. That's a lot of it's taking place in France. There's going to be bits and pieces of it in Algeria, and wondrous stuff involving fights on the riverboats. I realized that I didn't have a riverboat scene the first 2 novels, and the chronology is moving forward into the 1870s to where actually that's no longer practicable, because the old grand age of the Mississippi riverboats faded as the railroads took that away. Novels into audio. I tried to do an audio version of it, but the fellow that was doing it for nothing, to edit out the various things that we're going with, got sidetracked onto other projects, and he wasn't a money-making thing. He was just doing it gratis. So that one would be another matter. But yeah, and I must admit, trying to do the second story has got some Australian accents in it, and I probably am not good enough to do that. So I think that'll probably have to wait until if it reaches the point where I've got enough novels out and somebody that is higher up on the food chain takes note of them and goes, hey, these are really quite good, then that could reach the stage where they can get into a bigger market, to where a regular publisher takes over. And at that point, I would want to do them with illustrations. I had collected for every single one of the novels photographs of the period, and I actually have an illustrated version of the books that I have for personal relation that shows an awful lot of the stuff. So there's actually photographs of what the interior of the Great Eastern looked like. There's photographs of what the railroad, the shipping dock there in San Francisco, and all of that stuff. They're actually archival photographs I were able to find, but I didn't put them in the books that I did because I didn't have the rights to use them in the book. Maybe find one that could read that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, if somebody out there has the connections with people who do audiobooks and wants to kind of arrange that thing, we got 2 books out now. And so that would give them a hell of a lot of wherewithal and time to be able to process all of that. And there would be a steady stream of novels coming out in the years and years and years and years and years to come on that. But yeah, I know the audiobook market is enormous. There's an awful lot of people that make use of that, and it requires a good sound editor mixer to do the thing, and it needs to have the right kind of voice actors. Some people can do them all with a relatively small cast. and presumably would require money to do all of that stuff. So anyway, it's out of my wheelhouse on that. I'm not an expert on that. So we're just about there. Yes, the rocks were their kid version. I know, Lamont. Yeah, that would like to do it. It's not an easy one to think what to do with it, and that's another one probably where somebody who is into doing kids books from a science point of view could help with the project as a collaborative effort. But again, there's a whole bunch of things that requires illustrations, and it requires a tightness of production that my mind is not going to be a help on it. I would make it too long, and it would be very difficult to get it squeezed down to the right kind of stuff. So anyway, we're at an hour. We got a whole bloody hour in it, although there was only a partial on science, but yet Sneaky Pete's, all of the science fiction novels have a hell of a lot of relationship of science. I mean, even down to where do you find uranium in the 19th century? In the second novel, the discussion of what are those stars and stuff up in the sky? Are they actually galaxies and all of that? These issues come up in the various storylines, and I love playing off of the fact that both Verne and Wells lived so long ago that a lot of their understanding of the sciences was wrong. Verne especially, because he died in 1904, but H.G. Wells, although he lived into the era of relativity and had an inkling about that and quantum theory, a lot of the biological stuff, basically one of the things that one of these books on Wells pointed out is that Wells's notion of biology was basically what he got in school years ago. So it was effectively way out of date. And Julian Huxley, who was a friend of Wells, berated him at times about how antiquated his knowledge of. He was just way behind the curve on even the genetics of the 1930s. Well, he would have known, neither one of them knew about DNA and homeobox genes and all the stuff that we have an understanding of today, in addition to quarks and black holes and all of the fun and games about dark matter and all of that. So we have a vastly plate tectonics and all of that came along after that. So anyway, I'll rattle on like this indefinitely. Shameless plug. Oh, yes, a shameless plug. I should put up shameless plug. We got to get our rocks book here in a minute. And come on here. Now let me see a connector to work here. Voila. And we will share. There we go. And we will see whether this works. Click, click, bump. There we go. Whee! Peter's wonderful little advert for the book. It's a real book. It's a big book. And volume 2 will be just as big. Very proud of it. We were very careful on our documentation. We have a lot of stuff that isn't available anywhere else with any criticism of creationism. There's nuggets of, wow, I didn't know that, all over the place. And that's the end of that. Voila. And there's the shameless plug. We'll certainly be making the rounds with everyone that we can. I hope Paulogia will do another shameless plug episode on his channel when we get the second one out. So will volume 2 be in time for Christmas? Probably not. I really am certain that we're spilling over into 2024 on that. So it will be no wine before it's time, no science book before. Not read it through. Also bought a copy for Lavender Lady. Oh, excellent. Yeah. So anyway, see you all next week, kids, except no wooden penguins. We're starting to get into another heat wave here in Spokane. Not nearly as bad as a lot of other places, but we could be pushing into the 90s here in another week. So fortunately, I've got a little air conditioner thing in the back room that can cool things down to not quite so toasty. So next